Okay, folks, we shall start. Those who don't know me, I'm Kathleen O'Regan, the Executive Director of Sydney Business Chamber, and a big warm welcome to the people in our audience and our studio. It's been fantastic running these events online, and I'm sure you will see more coming up both this year and next year. I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land of which I'm on, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. But today is all about arts and culture, and it is the fourth episode in our series on arts and culture. And it's been fantastic, and many of you have come on the journey. And I actually can see, I think Grant Dogwell's with us, who's been a previous speaker at one of our other episodes. But we've really traversed a range of topics, from the economic value of arts and culture, through to how the arts and culture sector has used innovation and technology and really as a medium to express art, but also how to leverage what's currently been going traditionally inside buildings. And we've also looked at that interaction between arts and culture and the urban environment. But I also would like to welcome our guests. Minister, thank you for coming. Minister Fletcher has been a fantastic supporter of the Chamber, so I thank you for coming into the studio today.
Pleasure.
And Lee, it's been great to have you. I know you've been a leader not just in your world, but across the industry, so it's fantastic to have you here. And Esther, thank you for joining us. I've spent a lot of time talking to you online, so it's fantastic to see you in person. But Minister, if I can start with you, if that's all right, just to kick things off. How's arts and culture performing, and where do you see it fitting into the overall Australian landscape?
Clearly, in the short term, the arts sector has been hit very hard by COVID, with performances cancelled, venues closed, artists losing their gigs. We're starting to see some shoots of light. I went to see the Sydney Symphony Orchestra on Wednesday night, and they billed it as a half performance, half rehearsal for a small group of supporters, but they're about to get back out there. The longer term story, I think, about arts and culture, particularly linked to the future of a great city like Sydney, is about the importance of arts and culture in urban amenity. In 3 years in the urban infrastructure portfolio, I heard a lot from the urban planning people about urban amenity and how we want to create vibrant, buzzy places that people enjoy being in. We want our CBDs to be much more activated than they have been historically. If we think about the way that, the Sydney Opera House or any other major performing arts venue attracts lots of people, those are people who are often going to restaurants or bars or cafes before or after a performance. Quite a few of them might well be staying overnight. So it generates a lot of economic activity, a lot of human activity and interaction. And I'll close on this point. The synergies between both publicly funded arts and also purely commercial arts activities and a knowledge economy in which more and more of us are employed based upon our capacity to think and to create, those synergies are very strong and growing. And there's been some great work done in the UK, for example, on how investment in public arts activities, national performance institutions, training institutions and so on, the spillovers from that to so many sectors of the knowledge economy, design, software, advertising and so on. There's an important economic role for the arts, as well as, of course, its intrinsic and inherent importance.
Yeah, and it has been sort of one of those topics we've really integrated, and I'll throw to you, Lee, because you've had your leadership with Sydney Film Festival, which did a great job, by the way, of using online as a medium. That was fantastic to see, but across the industry, what the minister's picking up there is a really beautiful nexus between the arts and culture community and industry, but more broadly, the economic benefits, the business benefits. Have you seen some things where that's worked well or maybe can work better?
Yeah, look, as the Minister says, the creative industry is a great leaky industry. We spill very well. We like to help. And the thing that I've noticed is there are anecdotal stories, and I'd like to give a couple of those, but there's some amazing research that's available at the moment. A new approach, the Australia Council Creating Your Future, pattern makers. And what's being quantifiably proven is that the importance of culture has increased over the last 5-10 years. With the AusCo research, they were saying 98% of people engage in the arts and 84% acknowledge that it's got a positive impact. And then the latest research done by Pattern Makers, they've been interviewing 150 companies looking at what people have been doing between May and September. So the trends are really exciting because people, first they adopted the online world. So people are changing their habits. There are new demographics that are doing things differently, discovering things that they didn't know they liked. So online culture, 74% of people are saying they're going to continue watching things online and consuming things. And also that there's a sense of returning to venues is to do with the trust in the cultural institutions and the artists who are taking them there. With Sydney Film Festival, we went from 180,000 people seeing films in cinemas to 70,000 people seeing them online. It's not a great economic outcome for the festival or the filmmakers, but it's a great experience for the public. And there's some sort of nexus between those two worlds that will continue. But our audience are saying they want to get back into cinema. We're already at the moment touring festivals around regional Australia, and we're achieving greater audience numbers than we did prior to COVID. So there's a great amount of trust there. But the new business models, which are really interesting about what can be innovation in creative industries, can go into corporate industries. The last example I'll give is Redline Productions at the Old Fitz. So they're a small pub theatre with 60 seats. When they cancelled because of COVID, the first thing they did was do an online reading of a play before the big organisations, but they didn't do it within Australia. They did it globally.
And I'm curious, Esty, from your work, because you're often a bridge between the creative sector and business and building those partnerships. Have you seen some of these new things happening that Lee's sort of suggesting, and different examples maybe?
There's a long history of arts and business partnerships. I think the longest may be, we think it might be Opera Australia and Qantas. But there are some common drivers that always exist in business partnerships, and it's about mutual value. On one hand, it's access to new markets for business, brand benefits that arts and culture can offer business, exclusive or particular client or customer experiences that they can offer. And what we've seen is arts and culture organisations adapt to continue delivering those benefits to business. One really great example is the Melbourne Digital Concert Hall, which has sprung up with performances with money going directly to musicians, but certainly business partners have come on board to back that and access that new audience. But what I think exists really is the untapped potential of business partnerships. The research from A New Approach has shown that the multiplier effects of an investment in arts and culture is higher than in other industries.
It's interesting, you've got government doing some work, you've got the creative sector, then you have business. Is there a way that we can foster that tripartite almost relationship? Or have you seen some great examples where that's worked well?
Well, clearly with the struggle to emerge from the challenges of COVID and the particular impact it's having on the arts sector, I think we are seeing contributions from each of those areas that you've mentioned. So certainly, we've committed our $250 million JobMaker plan for the creative economy, and that's really important in terms of providing funding, particularly through what we're calling the RISE grants, to essentially co-invest with arts companies, entrepreneurs, promoters.
Philanthropy has really grown over the last 10 years, but this year's become something where the philanthropists who support different organisations feel they are the organisation, so it's their personal responsibility to help. And I don't think there's been the opportunity for corporates to do it to that level yet, but I think once we're back in the public arena, that's going to be where the really interesting corporate partnerships will step up, because I do think there's a sense of shared values about if you're going to bring a culture and a country back into being innovative, smart, and a really strong positive recovery, it's individuals, creative sector and corporate that have that responsibility. So what we've seen is the canary in the tunnel are the philanthropists, but I would hope the corporates behave in the same way.
Have you seen similar?
Yeah, what excites me about the that you both referred to about audience members giving for the first time is they've had that opportunity to experience the joy of giving to an organisation, and so I'm excited to see what the cultural sector does with those new relationships and the opportunity to grow that. One thing I'll say about business partnerships is that behind every business is a group of individuals who are human beings with their own hopes and dreams for this country. And there is certainly a high number of individuals within business who, in a personal capacity, deeply understand the value of arts and culture and bring their head, heart and hands to organisations and invest in organisations in a personal capacity. I also think they show leadership within their own organisations. There's many reasons. You absolutely have to have the business case for a business partnership to succeed. But there's so many other reasons why business partnerships succeed. And the number one thing it comes down to is relationships and influence within an organisation.
People privately, creatively and in business talk about values much more in the last 8 months than ever. You work on your values. You either, for the Sydney Film Festival, we're almost 70 years old, so you partly take them for granted, but every so often you articulate them. And we'd gone through that process, much like the Art Gallery in November last year. And everybody in the organisation cling to those values. And what you look for is organisations and governments that identify those values as well. And therefore you feel that's the start of the collaboration.
Has there sort of been a shift in your thinking as to how government can play a role?
Well, clearly, as a nation, we're going through a very challenging and even traumatic experience. And the arts has an important role to play in helping us as human beings understand, process, deal with, try and make sense of the experiences that we collectively have, including difficult experiences, and this is one of the more difficult. And so I do think there'll be a creative dividend out of this. And I think in the approaches to funding, we will be interested to see whether there are works that are stimulated by COVID and what our response to it has been, and what it's said to us about our values as Australians, the way that we as a society have dealt with this. I think we generally feel collectively that we've dealt with it better than a lot of other countries, but I think there's a role for the arts in understanding, explaining, interpreting, commenting, critiquing all of our national response to this great challenge.
Yeah, because I'm finding it interesting. There's so many sort of people who talk about they've rediscovered their local community.
Yes.
And it's, I don't know if it's even up in your election, you that coffee shop, then there's a park behind it and there's different ways. And I don't know if it's a rebirth of some of the creative community, even at that local level, rather than going to a big institution. And that's where a lot of funding would go to a big institution.
I think that's an important point, that arts funding typically defaults to the big flagship companies in the big cities and mainly the CBDs. And a possible outcome of all of this, and one that I hope we can achieve, is a little more of a balance towards regional areas, towards our suburbs. You take Sydney, it's a massive urban area, 5 million plus. It doesn't necessarily make sense that all of our, or much of our creative activity is concentrated in a small area, and that does raise issues about accessibility. When we announced our $250 million package, we quite consciously chose to do it at the Sydney Coliseum Theatre in Rooty Hill, because we wanted to underline the point that there is lots of activity occurring outside of the CBD of Sydney, and what I also hope we'll see, and it'll depend upon the advice I get from my department, I guess, in the assessment of the individual grant applications, but I hope we will see a little bit of a reweighting so that some of the funding is going to perhaps art forms that might not have been funded before, and occurring in geographies where it might not have been funded before.
And I think the other thing that is shifting is perhaps a repositioning of arts organisations as entrepreneurial, resourceful, inventive organisations that are very capable of thriving. They and can be sustainable as well. I think, the word sustainable doesn't mean that there can't be public and private investment in the arts.
I think it's a really important question. I think it's a very big opportunity. If you look at some of the things we've been doing in screen policy recently, firstly, we've announced $400 million over the next 7 years for the location incentive. That's the way that works is to top up the location offset so that effectively, if you bring an international production, film or television to Australia, you'll get 30% of the cost of the production returned to you through the tax system. And we've done that to be competitive with a number of other places, but also because we think we've got a really significant opportunity to attract substantial production activity to Australia, building on the fact that we're seen globally to be a place that has managed COVID well. Our screen sector moved very quickly to establish some COVID-safe protocols. Our domestic sector is very much back at work with the support of our $50 million temporary interruption fund. But if we can get some of these big global productions, for example, the ones that we announced kicking off in Queensland, Young Rock and Irreverent amongst them, will between them generate 1,000 jobs as well as 2,000 opportunities for extras. So building a bigger place in the global screen ecosystem. Then in the changes we announced a couple of weeks ago, they're all about trying to target our support for Australian productions so they're going to be better suited to the global streaming market. We've all seen how the SVODs, the streaming video on demand services, have come out of nowhere in the last few years. I mean, Netflix now has over 5 million subscriptions in Australia. That's up from 0 5 or 6 years ago. And that explosion is happening globally. That means a big demand for content and a big opportunity for us to get Australian content being acquired by streaming services and seen globally. And I was with Screen Australia this morning talking to Graham Mason, the Chief Executive. He gave me a couple examples of productions that they've put money into, Australian productions, which have been seen in one instance by 20 million people and another instance by 50 million people around the globe. And so I think that's one example of the way that the explosion of digital content and digital channels means that Australian creatives have an opportunity to be seen not just in Australia but globally. It's a much bigger market. It's also obviously a more competitive market, and you have to be more ambitious and more ready to take risks. But if we want Australian creative work to be seen by as many people as possible, I think it's an opportunity we've got to go after.
Lee?
Look, I think Grant's conversational question, we always go to screen content being stories on screen, but the other industries that are doing very well is theatre and visual arts. So, for instance, at the moment there's the Sydney Contemporary Art Fair, which is Barry Kaldoudis's Carriageworks Extravaganza, which is an amazing art fair. It's like Art Basel or Art Miami, but now that it's online, they're ahead in sales than they would normally be. They can sell internationally. So rather than going just to the screen sector, the opportunity for enlarging Australian business, creative business overseas and internationally is manifold. The ability, we're all getting used to working on Zoom and working together, so the ability for Australian creatives to be involved in international productions and working in different ways is also explored. I think we're in that we don't know what we don't know yet. And there will be some pain and adjustment of going from the financial models we're currently in to new ones. And that's going to be tough. But again, if there's that collaboration between state, federal and local government and industry sectors such as Screen Australia in working what that transition is, then it does open up amazing possibilities.
Essie, do you have a view where our opportunities are looking outside?
Yeah, I guess taking a slightly different angle, I think our creative output is enriched by the collaborations that happen amongst international artists. So there's some organisations that are doing really cool stuff to make sure that peer networking and that peer collaboration has the opportunity to continue. Performance Space, which is just about to run its Live Works festival, there's always a big networking component to that. And they're playing around with some really cool technology that lets people adopt avatars. So, creatives who would otherwise come to the festival for that opportunity to engage with other experimental artists, to adopt avatars, be there live. And it's even down to you can, if I'm standing closer to you, Minister, I could hear you speak louder than the person, in the other side of the room. So using some of the, that new virtual reality, I'm not sure if I've got the terminology right, to make sure that artists still have the opportunity to collaborate internationally, because that I think grows the cultural, the artistic output for everyone.
Can I just pick up on that point? I'm sometimes asked, why does your portfolio include both communications and the arts? And my answer is, as the world of digital becomes more and more important, including in the arts, it's a connection that makes a huge amount of sense. 20 years ago, there was a book called The Death of Distance, which was written by a journalist at The Economist, and her argument was the internet means that we no longer need to come together face to face. We'll all work remotely, we'll work from home, we'll video conference. It was a great theory, but the technology wasn't up to it 20 years ago. What we've now seen in this great unplanned experiment over this year is that the technology does make it possible for us to collaborate, as Lee was saying. And that's not just locally, but internationally. And I'm noticing, and I think we're probably all noticing in our professional lives, that suddenly you're having video conferences with people overseas, where previously it would have seemed to take a very long time to set up any kind of discussion.
It also would have been rude to ask. If you're looking for collaborators and there's someone in Bolivia who's the right person, you wouldn't ask because, they're there. Yeah. But it's incredible.
And so one of the things we're then focused on is, okay, how do we make sure we've got the connectivity all around Australia so that we can take advantage of that? One of the things we've announced recently, we announced some major upgrades to the NBN. Part of that is $700 million for what we're calling 240 business fibre zones, including AD5 and regional areas. These are zones where you'll be able to order a fibre optic connection, enterprise Ethernet, 1 gigabit symmetrical, so very high speed. There'll be no upfront charge, whereas up till now you've often had to pay several $1,000s, sometimes several tens of thousands of dollars. And the wholesale price will be the same as in our CBDs. It's a bit complicated, but today broadband pricing is cheapest in our CBDs, and there's a series of geographic zones around Australia. We're essentially taking CBD pricing to 85 regional centres. And so that means if you're an animation business or a graphic designer or any one of many, many fields where high-speed connectivity is important, it'll suddenly be feasible for you to locate in Port Macquarie or Mount Gambier or Rockhampton and have exactly the same connectivity as in the centre of Sydney. And we didn't necessarily plan this to happen at the same time as COVID came along and produced this giant global experiment in video conferencing, but it's going to be, I think it'll have significant consequences, and certainly in the arts and the creative sectors. One of the things we're thinking about at the moment is how good or not good is the connectivity to remote Indigenous communities and Indigenous arts centres. We're doing a bit of an audit on that at the moment, and I'll be interested to see what that finds out and whether there are some things we can do to in turn then help remote Indigenous artists be selling into a global market.
Managing each of those venues, as Kerry's sort of saying, I don't know if you've seen the state government's brought all of those together under one roof. Whether, how does that relate even to some of the, whether it's through the digital space, or whether it's our international, presence. I don't know if you've had much thought around those sorts of venues that Kerry's.
Well, I think it's very important. One of the things we've been thinking about in terms of the shorter term economic recovery, again, is the role of the arts in stimulating tourism. Australia Council put out some work earlier this year on the value of cultural tourism. Cultural tourists tend to stay longer and spend more, and that can be people, flying from Sydney to Melbourne to go to a big musical or see an exhibition. It can be people coming from overseas to go to Indigenous art centres. So it's a significant driver of tourism, significant driver of hospitality spend, significant driver of accommodation spend. And so the economic spillover effects from arts are very important. But certainly I think from an urban planning perspective, it is well worthwhile to think about what's the impact of major arts and sports venues, and Kerry's point obviously that a stadium can be hosting a cricket match or a footy match one day, and all kinds of cultural performances the next day. If you look at Adelaide, for example, and the impact of the redevelopment of the Adelaide Cricket Ground and the impact that's had on the hospitality sector in Adelaide, is just one example of the importance of these kinds of venues. Another good example actually is we introduced a policy of city deals some years ago where you bring together state, Commonwealth and local governments with a view to saying, how do we take some deliver some significant structural change in a particular geography. So in Townsville, a centrepiece of that was the new stadium, first of all for rugby league, but it will be used for a whole range of other community events as well. And so when you look at that whole issue of urban activation, things that bring people together are very important, and arts and culture events have a very significant role there.
And has that played out either from your perspective, Leah, or Essie? How's the sector, in your view, then collaborated with venue operators? Does that work well, or is that a piece that's sort of?
It's tough.
Yeah.
New South Wales has been going through an infrastructure overhaul, which hasn't actually opened yet, but Walsh Bay's one precinct, the new gallery, the museum, all of that development in 10 years' time will make this a different place. There's always a challenge when you're trying to multi-purpose a space. So a sports space then being deliberately used for culture, it almost has to be done before it's built, because the setup of infrastructure necessary for an orchestra performance as opposed to kind of a rock band opening a sports event is quite different. So if the infrastructure planning thinks about that and prioritises that at the beginning, then it will happen. But it's about making the balance deliberate, because otherwise it becomes unaffordable for cultural organisations to engage in those big commercial venues.
Yeah. Has that been your experience, Essie? Or I'm just thinking the business partnerships, there's big corporate sponsorship of stadiums, but that's not necessarily spilling over. I'm using those words, spilling over into the community. Is there a way that we could link maybe some of those sorts of partnerships?
Yeah. What and to the minister's point that there's the big arts organisations, and then there's also a whole suite of smaller organisations doing incredible work outside of the CBD. There's certainly been examples of organisations using existing spaces in really novel ways. So perhaps not the big infrastructure projects. An example that springs to mind is Urban Theatre Projects, who are based out in Bankstown, and they do really great stuff with unused space about to be demolished, but they've also had this great initiative called the Black Box Initiative that's been out here in Barangaroo. It's also been at Blacktown, I think it was, and there were plans to travel it around the country, and what that does is bring people to a space which they might otherwise go to, but to think about that space differently. It's an Indigenous-led initiative. The architecture of the Black Box itself is an Indigenous designer, and it invites people to come into the the piece that is erected on the space, and have a deep listening experience to reconnect with the place that they're sitting in a different way, and with a different understanding. And so I think, beyond the big infrastructure projects, there's also opportunities for cultural organisations to use existing space to allow the public to come and think about that space and how they use it in a different way.
Thinking about who the public is, because as we know, the demographics of Australia has vastly changed. It's not Anglo proscenium arch led anymore, and nor should it be. So where artists want to perform regionally or in different areas, not just CBD, is different. So it's actually not infrastructure; it's investment in artists and going to where they go. Because I know in regional New South Wales, the artists living there perform in 130-year-old wooden halls. They don't want a proscenium arch because it's about music, it's about engaging in a different way. So it's actually allowing the artists to make the work where their public is.
Yeah, and where the communities feel comfortable and eager to come and see that work. It's a great point, Lee.
So, Minister, like many people I think out there, there's been some conversations around the RISE grants and the 250 million. So I think in terms of where it is, where is that currently at in terms of its spend and its allocation.
Yep.
So I don't think you'd be surprised by that question.
No, indeed. Well, look, we announced the package at the end of June. We then went to the process of calling for applications. So it is important that we give everybody a reasonable period of time to be aware of the grant opportunity and put their applications in. And so we've now, what we've also said in terms of the RISE grants is that we're going to allocate the funding on a rolling basis. So we're not going to wait until some predetermined period. We'll choose a point, weigh up the applications that have been received so far, make decisions, announce those, and then go on to the next lot of applications that are coming in. So we're very well advanced on that. We're considering a first set of applications now. We've had a really good range of applications, very diverse all around the country, some really good ideas. And so I'm very confident we'll be able to announce and deploy funds well before the end of the year. And what I hope is that we'll see some, exciting new things being done, some innovation, some creativity, and this will really help spark a resurgence of artistic and creative activity. Pleasingly, we set aside 50 million for the temporary interruption fund, so that's specific to screened film and television. And that was to deal with the specific problem that the film financiers were not releasing funding because they could not get insurance against key person risk due to COVID. And so that fund has worked extremely well, and we've got a lot of productions now underway around the country with the support of that fund. So there's money already deployed. There's money that we're hard at work on being about to deploy reasonably soon. And so I'm confident we're going to see quite a creative dividend out of all of this.
I don't know if you guys had any other comments about the funding, because it's look, I honestly think in terms of right here, right now, the amount of funds that are going out the door at all levels of government is astonishing. Yeah.
The one thing I would say, individually, City of Sydney, so local level, state government and federal government have responded and set up funding. If I was the boss, I just wish it was one pot and you had one policy to be able to disperse all of those funds, because I think, as you say, the dividend of what's happening, you're not setting up funds to save an industry, you're setting up funds to invest in the future industry that will exist. So the more you collaborate with those other governments, I think the result will be more exciting.
Yeah, and that's definitely the case. I think there's a number of local governments that have done some amazing things and working together, get the biggest bang for your buck.
We are certainly seeking to work, particularly with state and territory governments, in the funding process, and there are some state governments that have essentially sought to set aside money and say specifically we want to use this to leverage the impact of federal government money, or conversely to have the federal government money leverage the effect of the money that the state government puts in. So I hope we'll see a fair bit of that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it's been great. We are coming up to time, and maybe just to think about pulling all that together and knowing that there's an unprecedented amount of funding, but I also think there's an unprecedented amount of unity and will. I think we're all on the same page trying to get the outcomes that, not just get us through the response now, but create a great place and a great industry and a great partnership across the business sector as well. But if I put to each of you the question is, so it's been a lot of pain, so what would be the one thing that you would like to see, say in all going well with COVID and vaccines, but say, in 6, maybe 12 months' time, what would be a great legacy from all this, challenge that we've had? So I'll start with you, Lee, only because you're next to me.
Yeah, look, I think what I just said is what I really hope for is that the governments work together, and also that this break and restart, and as I refer to the we don't know what we don't know, that it creates opportunities for artists who were left out of the silos, because, there's been wonderful work done institutionally over the years, but there are new ideas and new creators who, through this gap, will emerge, and I hope that they're invested in for the long term, because I think that this sector, this very leaky sector, hopefully will become more leaky and more artists will be engaged in it in the future, so that we're not going back to what it was, but there will be new ways of working in the future.
I like this leaky analogy. Minister, what's one thing that you see you'd like to see as a legacy for this?
I'd like to see, first of all, numbers of people coming to shows, be it performing arts, visual arts, whatever it is, getting back to where it had been. That'll take longer than 12 months, but I'd like to see that happen as soon as possible. And that'll also depend upon international tourism or international travel being permitted, because, a lot of people, over the summer, about 50% of the people coming to see Opera Australia performances at Sydney Opera House are tourists. So we won't get the numbers back until we've got the borders fully reopened. So that will take, I fear, longer than 12 months, but that's the first thing I'd like to see. Second thing I'd like to see coming out of this is Australia's reputation globally as a place where great creative work is being done, being enhanced.
Esty?
What I'd love to see is the celebration continue of the private investment in the arts. So our research estimated that it was $608 million in private investment in the arts between business partnerships and individuals. And we've seen a number of individuals give generously over the last period to the arts. And so to see those individuals use their influence and leadership in the business community to drive greater business investments in the arts for all of those great outcomes that we've spoken about. I have one more as well, which is a little bit nerdy, but to continue the data piece, to get some more meat on the bone for the creative industries around what are the benefits. We've got some great quantitative and qualitative research that's been produced recently, both from the independent think tank A New Approach, which we've all mentioned, and encourage everyone to read all of their working papers, but for the business community, particularly the most recent one, which really quantifies that leakiness of the arts sector. But there's also others about the transformative impacts of the arts, and also the view from Middle Australia, and debunks that myth that Australians don't value the arts. In fact, they do, and they understand very well the benefits to arts, both in terms of the business benefits, but also the social benefits. We at Creative Partnerships are also continuing our research to continue quantifying the investment in the arts from the private sector, both individuals and business. So I think the more of that we have, the more we are able to make our case from a position of strength and evidence, and I think that can only do us well in times like these.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I do want to thank each and every one of you, Estate Minister and Lee, today for your time. But thank you, everybody, for joining us. I know some of you have gone to every single one of our episodes. It's been fantastic to have you with us on the journey. And, a big shout out to all our speakers who we've had through each and every one of them. There's such a different perspective brought on the sector. I've learned a lot, and I hope each and every one of you learned a lot.